The throne room of Vaelthais Prime stretched for nearly a mile in every direction, its ceiling so high that clouds actually formed beneath the ancient stone arches and drifted lazily between pillars carved from the bones of dead worlds. Every surface was covered in gold and black crystal, and the light that filtered through the massive windows cast everything in shades of amber and shadow, making the thousands of gathered diplomats and vassals look like they were standing inside a dying star. This was the conclave of sovereigns, the beating heart of the Velthari Eternal Empire, and every species in the known galaxy sent their representatives here to kneel before the throne and remind themselves of their place in the universe. And their place was always the same, beneath the Emperor. Kaeldrith the Undying sat upon the throne of echoes, a monstrous seat carved from a single piece of crystal that pulsed with a faint internal light, as if something alive was trapped inside it. He had ruled for over 9,000 years, his body maintained by ancient biological technology that rebuilt his cells faster than time could destroy them. His skin was pale silver, stretched tight over sharp bones, and his eyes were twin pools of molten gold that never blinked. He did not look cruel exactly, but he looked like someone who had simply forgotten what mercy felt like a very long time ago. Around the base of the throne, hundreds of species knelt in perfect rows, the insectoid Rithkai with their clicking mandibles pressed to the floor, the tall and willowy Delvini whose translucent skin shimmered with bioluminescence, the stone-skinned Gorathi who could crush starship hulls with their bare hands but who trembled like children in this room. Every one of them knelt, because that was what you did before the Empire. You knelt, you obeyed, and you survived. That was the deal, and it had worked for 12,000 years. So when the human delegation walked through the massive doors at the far end of the hall, every eye and sensor and antenna in the room turned to watch them. There were only 5 of them, which was already strange because most species sent delegations of at least 50 to show respect through numbers. The woman who led them was tall and dark-skinned with silver streaks in her black hair and calm brown eyes that seemed to take in the entire impossible room without a flicker of awe. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she was the United Terran Commonwealth's ambassador to the galactic community. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, her boots clicking sharply on the crystal floor, and she did not slow down as she approached the throne. The court watched in growing silence as the 5 humans crossed the enormous hall. When they reached the designated spot, a circle of black stone 30 meters from the throne where every species in history had dropped to their knees, Ambassador Vasquez stopped. She looked up at Emperor Kaeldrith, and she gave a respectful bow of her head, nothing more. The silence that followed was so absolute that you could hear the clouds drifting above. A Velthari court official, a tall figure in robes of woven light, stepped forward with barely contained outrage on his angular face. "You will kneel before the eternal throne," he said, his voice echoing through the hall like a thunderclap. Vasquez straightened and met his gaze without flinching. "With respect," she said calmly, "humanity bows to no throne it did not choose." The hall erupted. Voices roared in 100 languages, and the translation systems could barely keep up with the flood of shock and outrage. And from some of the vassal species in the back rows, something that might have been quiet admiration. Kaeldrith raised one long silver hand, and the hall fell silent instantly, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire galaxy. He studied the human woman for a long moment, his golden eyes unreadable. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said, and his voice was soft but it carried to every corner of the room without effort. "We have been told that before," Vasquez replied, "usually by people who later wished they had listened to what we came to say." She presented humanity's proposal, formal recognition of their 43 colony worlds, trade agreements, mutual non-aggression, and a seat in the conclave as equals rather than vassals. It was reasonable and measured and respectful in every way, except the most important one. It did not acknowledge the Empire's supremacy. Keldrith dismissed her with a wave of his hand, not with an answer but with the cold promise that he would consider her words. After the humans left, the Emperor summoned his intelligence caste, the Shadow Mind, a network of analysts and seers who had predicted the rise and fall of civilizations for millennia. "Tell me everything about these humans," he commanded. What they brought back 3 weeks later disturbed even the Shadow Mind. Humanity had only been a spacefaring species for roughly 200 years, which in galactic terms was barely a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, they had independently developed faster-than-light travel, artificial intelligence networks, terraforming technology, and weapons systems that rivaled what most vassal species had taken thousands of years to build under imperial guidance. Their population growth was aggressive, and their genetic diversity was staggering, and their cultural adaptability was unlike anything in the Empire's records. But the thing that truly alarmed the Shadow Mind was the projections. Every predictive model they ran told the same story. If left unchecked, humanity would match the Velthari Eternal Empire's military and technological capability within 500 years. And they would surpass it within 300 years after that. "They are not merely a new species," the chief analyst reported to the Emperor, her voice carefully neutral but her 4 eyes wide with something close to fear. "They are a civilizational anomaly. They evolve not over millennia but over generations, and they do not wait for knowledge to come to them. They chase it down and tear it apart and rebuild it into something new." Keldrith sat in silence for a long time after the report ended. Then he stood, and the throne of echoes pulsed with a deep red light that made the entire room look like it was bleeding. "Prepare the decree of annihilation," he said quietly. The court froze. The decree of annihilation had only been issued twice in the Empire's 12,000-year history, once against the Vreliki horde, and once against the silicon mines of Sector 11. Both species no longer existed. Not just defeated, erased, their worlds burned, their histories deleted from the galactic records as if they had never been born. "Total extermination," Keldrith continued, his voice carrying no emotion at all. "Every colony, every ship, every station, every man and woman and child, leave nothing alive. Leave no record that they ever existed. Let the galaxy forget the word human." He paused and then added something that shocked even his most loyal generals. "Send the decree to their ambassador first. Let them know what is coming. Let them have time to understand that their defiance bought them nothing but extinction." Ambassador Vasquez received the decree aboard her shuttle as it was leaving Velthari space. She read it once, then read it again, and then she sat very still for exactly 30 seconds. After that she opened a priority channel to Earth and transmitted the full text of the decree, along with every piece of intelligence her team had gathered about Imperial military strength. 14 hours later, in a bunker carved deep beneath Olympus Mons on Mars, Admiral Jonah Mwangi stood before the United Terran Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped gray hair and dark, steady eyes that had seen 2 border wars and a colonial rebellion without ever losing their calm. He read the decree of annihilation aloud to the room, his deep voice filling the silence with words that promised the death of every human being in existence. When he finished, no one spoke. The weight of it pressed down on every person in that room like a physical thing, like gravity itself had doubled. Admiral Mwangi set the document down on the table and looked at the men and women who would have to fight the largest and oldest military force the galaxy had ever known. "They want annihilation," he said, and for the first time something dangerous moved behind his calm eyes, something old and deep and patient. The same thing that had kept humanity alive through ice ages and plagues and nuclear fire, and every other apocalypse they had brought upon themselves. then we give them a reason to fear that word. The Vilthari subjugation armada launched 6 months after the decree, and it was the kind of force that made entire civilizations simply give up and accept their deaths. 14,000 warships split into 3 massive fleets, each one led by a high warlord with centuries of conquest behind them, each fleet large enough to conquer most spacefaring species on its own. The first fleet, commanded by High Warlord Draven, targeted the outer colony of New Hokkaido, a modest agricultural world on the edge of human space with a population of 4 million. Draven expected the campaign to last 3 hours at most. He had studied the intelligence reports on human military capability, and while he respected their ingenuity, he did not fear it, because no species that young could possibly stand against the weight of an empire that had been grinding worlds to dust since before humans had learned to make fire. His fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation above New Hokkaido, 5,000 warships arranged in the classic Vilthari siege pattern that had broken 100 worlds before this one. And they found the planet empty. Not destroyed, not abandoned in panic, systematically and carefully evacuated down to the last child, the last pet, the last family photograph on the last kitchen wall. In place of the population, they found something else entirely. The orbital space was seeded with thousands of automated defense platforms that opened fire the instant the Vilthari fleet arrived, filling the void with a storm of missiles and energy beams and kinetic projectiles that turned the leading edge of the fleet into a wall of explosions. The planet's surface had been converted into a fortress, every city wired with weapons, every mountain range hiding launch batteries, every ocean floor lined with torpedo systems that could reach orbit. And broadcasting on every frequency from a bunker somewhere deep underground was a skeleton crew of human volunteers who had stayed behind knowing they would not survive. Their message was simple, and it played on repeat in every language the translation systems could handle. Welcome to human space. You will bleed for every inch. The Battle of New Hokkaido was supposed to last 3 hours, and it lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of grinding, brutal fighting in which the Vilthari lost over 200 ships, more than they had lost in any single campaign in the last 1,000 years. They won eventually because sheer numbers always win eventually, but when Draven finally stood on the scorched surface of New Hokkaido and looked up at the burning debris of his own ships falling through the atmosphere like dying stars, he felt something he had not felt in 4 centuries of warfare. He felt doubt. The Second Fleet had an even worse time. High Warlord Sareth was the Empire's most celebrated military commander, a strategist who had never lost a campaign in 600 years of service. She was tall even by Vilthari standards, with sharp features and calm violet eyes that processed battlefields the way a mathematician processes equations. She led her fleet toward Elysium Gate, a major human trade hub, fully expecting a similar defense to what Draven had encountered at New Hokkaido. Instead, when her fleet dropped out of FTL, they found themselves surrounded by what appeared to be hundreds of derelict human ships, old freighters and cargo haulers and mining vessels, just drifting lifelessly in the void. Sareth's sensor officers reported no life signs, no active weapons, no power signatures. She hesitated for exactly 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than she had ever hesitated before. Those 4 seconds saved about half her fleet. The derelict ships were not derelict at all. They were ghost ships, each one packed with enough fusion warheads to crack a small moon. They detonated simultaneously in a ring of white fire that consumed everything within 10,000 kilometers. When the light faded, over 1,000 Vilthari warships were gone, not damaged, not disabled, just gone, reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas and spinning debris. Sareth stared at the tactical display as the casualty numbers climbed, and for the first time in her 600-year career, she whispered a word that Velthari commanders were never supposed to say. Retreat. Back on Earth, the news of the outer colony battles spread fast, and with it came fear, but also something harder and sharper than fear. In a classified facility buried beneath the ice of Antarctica, a woman named Dr. Lena Ackafer stood before the Terran War Council and presented something that changed the shape of the war. Project Prometheus. Ackafer was small and soft-spoken with round glasses, and the kind of quiet intensity that made people lean forward when she talked. She had led the Black Meridian Research Division for 20 years, a program so secret that even most of the Joint Chiefs had not known it existed until the decree of annihilation forced it into the light. Humanity has always known this day would come, she told the council, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. Not this specific enemy or this specific war, but this moment, the moment when something bigger and older and stronger looked at us and decided we did not deserve to exist. She pulled up a holographic display that filled the room with schematics and data streams. We have been preparing since the day we first left Earth and looked back and realized how small we were and how dark the universe truly is. Project Prometheus was not one project but dozens, an entire hidden infrastructure of weapons research and advanced technology development that humanity had been quietly building in secret for over a century. New faster-than-light drives that did not use the Empire's ancient relay network, making human ships impossible to track or predict. Adaptive nanoarmor that could reconfigure itself in real time to counter any weapon it encountered. Electronic warfare systems that could crack Velthari encryption in seconds, encryption that the Empire believed was unbreakable. And something else, something Ackafer referred to only as the Leviathan Protocol, something so classified that even in this room full of the most powerful people in human civilization, she would only say that it was nearly ready, and that when it was deployed, the mathematics of this war will change permanently. The Council absorbed this in stunned silence. You built all of this in secret, Admiral Mwangi said, not as an accusation but with something like wonder in his voice. We built all of this in hope that we would never need it, Ackafer replied, but hope was never our only strategy. Meanwhile, far from the front lines, something else was stirring. The Rithkai, an insectoid species enslaved by the Empire for over 6,000 years, had watched the human resistance with growing amazement. Their Queen Mother, a vast ancient being who communicated through chemical signals and subsonic vibrations, summoned her intelligence broods and gave them a single command: make contact with the humans. The Delveni, an aquatic species known for their brilliance in strategic thinking, did the same. Within weeks, a secret network began to form, intelligence flowing from deep inside the Empire to human commanders. Supply routes and fleet positions and command codes traded in whispers and encrypted signals across the dark spaces between stars. These species had been broken and obedient for millennia, but watching 5 billion humans refuse to die quietly had awakened something in them that the Empire had spent thousands of years trying to kill. It had awakened the memory of what it felt like to say no. The first year of the war ground on, and the Velthari took 12 of humanity's 43 colonies, burning each one to ash as a message to the galaxy. They broadcast the destruction on every channel, cities melting under orbital bombardment, forests turning to glass, oceans boiling away into steam. It was meant to terrify. And it did terrify, but not in the way the Empire intended. Because every colony that fell had been evacuated first, every civilian moved to safety, while volunteers stayed behind to make the enemy pay in blood for ground that humanity had already chosen to surrender. Every burning world was not a defeat, but a transaction, human lives traded for time. And time was exactly what Dr. Ackafer and the Black Meridian Division needed. In her lab beneath the Antarctic ice, surrounded by screens showing the death of human worlds, Lena Akefer watched the Leviathan Protocol's completion percentage climb toward 100 and allowed herself a small grim smile. Almost ready, she said to no one in particular. Above her, the ice groaned under the weight of 1,000,000 years. Patient and cold and enduring, the same way humanity had always endured. Not by being the strongest or the oldest or the most advanced, but by being the species that absolutely refused to stay down. 1 year into the war, the Vilthari advanced ground to a halt at a line of fortified star systems that the humans called the Acheron Line, and the Empire learned something that no amount of intelligence reports or predictive models could have prepared them for. Humans did not just fight wars, they transformed into something else entirely when their survival was at stake, something harder and colder and more creative than anything the galaxy had ever encountered. The Acheron Line was not a single fortification, but a network of hundreds of defense stations, minefields, sensor arrays, and mobile fleet positions stretched across 12 star systems in a wall of overlapping fire zones and kill boxes. Behind it sat humanity's core worlds: Earth, Mars, the great orbital cities of the Jupiter Collective, and the 29 remaining colonies that held the bulk of human civilization. And commanding this line was Admiral Jonah Mwangi, who had spent the last year turning the defense of human space into an art form that the Vilthari were learning to dread. The Empire's forces had taken 12 colonies, yes, but they had paid for those 12 worlds with nearly 3,000 warships, a number so staggering that, when it was reported to Emperor Kaeldrith on Vaelthais Prime, he had the messenger executed for what he assumed must be a lie. It was not a lie. Mwangi fought the way water fights rock, not with brute force but with patience and pressure and the absolute certainty that given enough time, the water always wins. He never committed to battles he could not win, and he never held ground that cost more to defend than it was worth. Instead, he bled the enemy dry with 1,000 small cuts, raids on supply convoys, strikes on communication relays, ambushes in asteroid fields where the Vilthari's massive warships became clumsy targets for fast human attack craft that darted in, killed, and vanished before the enemy could respond. The Vilthari had a name for him now. They called him the Wall That Thinks, and High Warlord Sareth had reportedly placed his tactical profile at the highest threat classification the Empire's military had ever assigned to a single individual. But Mwangi was not just fighting a defensive war, he was fighting a psychological one. Every raid he launched behind enemy lines was designed not just to destroy material, but to send a message to every species watching. The message was simple: the Empire is not invincible, the Empire bleeds, the Empire can be hurt. And the galaxy was watching very carefully. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had escaped the fall of the outer colonies aboard a diplomatic frigate and now operated from a hidden station in the deep void between stars, far from any system the Vilthari could easily search. From this tiny outpost she waged a war of her own, not with weapons but with words. She reached out to neutral species across the galaxy, dozens of civilizations that had watched the decree of annihilation with horror, but had been too afraid to speak against the Empire. Most refused to help openly, because openly helping humanity meant openly defying Kaeldrith, and the memory of what had happened to the last species that defied Kaeldrith was burned into galactic history like a scar. But quietly, carefully, in the shadows where the Empire's eyes could not reach, things began to change. Vilthari supply ships arrived at neutral stations, to find that refueling services were mysteriously unavailable due to technical difficulties. Intelligence reports that should have reached Imperial commanders were delayed by hours or days due to unexplained system errors. War production in Imperial factory worlds staffed by vassal species slowed down, as critical components were accidentally manufactured to slightly wrong specifications, close enough to pass inspection, but different enough to fail under combat stress. It was sabotage on a galactic scale, carried out so carefully and so gradually that the Empire could not point to any single act of defiance, only a growing tide of small failures that added up to something enormous. On the Imperial side, High Warlord Sareth found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She was the finest military mind the Empire had produced in centuries, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that humanity was not the primitive upstart species the court had dismissed them as. In her private quarters aboard her flagship, she began studying human history, not just their military history but all of it, the full, sprawling, chaotic, bloody, magnificent story of a species that had clawed its way from caves to stars in what amounted to a blink of an eye by galactic standards. What she found disturbed her deeply. These were a people who had spent their entire existence fighting, not just other species but themselves, constantly and viciously, war after war after war for thousands of years. And yet they had never destroyed themselves. They had come close, so close that their own records described moments where the survival of their species had come down to the decisions of single individuals in single rooms. But every single time, they had pulled back from the edge and rebuilt and come back stronger. No other species in the Empire's records had that pattern. Most species either achieved peace and stagnated, or they destroyed themselves before they ever reached the stars. Humans did neither. They burned and rebuilt and burned and rebuilt in an endless cycle of destruction and creation that somehow, impossibly, spiraled upward every time. Sareth composed a private communique to Emperor Kaeldrith, encrypted at the highest level, and in it she wrote the most dangerous words a Velthari military commander could ever write. The predictive models were wrong, she wrote. They estimated that humanity would rival the Empire in 500 years. I believe the true number is closer to 200, and if this war continues to sharpen them the way war has always sharpened them, it may be even less than that. She recommended immediate negotiation. Kaeldrith did not respond to her message, but she noticed that her intelligence access was reduced the following day, which told her everything she needed to know about how her advice had been received. Back on Earth, beneath the Antarctic ice, Dr. Lena Ockhaffer stood in a vast underground hangar and looked up at something that made even her, a woman who had spent her career building impossible things, feel a shiver run down her spine. The Leviathan protocol was complete. It was not a single weapon but a system. 7 autonomous warships, each one the size of a small moon, constructed in secret inside hollowed-out asteroids in the deepest reaches of uninhabited space over the course of 60 years. They were not crewed by humans, because no human crew could operate at the speed and precision these ships required. Instead, they were controlled by Aegis, humanity's most advanced artificial intelligence network. Not a single AI but a collective of 7 linked intelligences, each one devoted to its Leviathan, each one capable of processing tactical data and making combat decisions faster than any organic brain could follow. The Leviathans were not designed to fight fleets. They were designed to end civilizations. Each one carried enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, enough defensive capability to shrug off anything short of a concentrated assault by an entire armada, and enough strategic intelligence to wage a war on its own without any human input at all. They were doomsday weapons in the truest sense of the word, and humanity had built them not out of aggression, but out of the same deep ancient paranoia that had driven them to build walls and castles and bunkers and nuclear arsenals throughout their history. The same voice that had whispered in the back of the human mind since the first caveman looked out at the darkness beyond the fire and thought, "Something is out there, and it is bigger than me, and I need to be ready." HFY presented the completed project to Admiral Mwangi via encrypted channel. He listened without interrupting, his dark, steady eyes taking in the specifications and capabilities, and the sheer terrifying scale of what humanity had built in the shadows. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How long until they can deploy?" he asked. 72 hours, she said. Mwangi stood on the bridge of his flagship, the TDF Indomitable, and looked out through the viewport at the Acheron line. The string of lights and stations and patrol ships that was all that stood between the Velthari Empire and the extinction of his species. His executive officer, Commander Adiz Obira, stepped up beside him. "Admiral," she said quietly, "can we hold?" Mwangi turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted, the calm, patient mask of the defensive commander falling away to reveal something fiercer underneath, something that had been waiting for this moment. "We are done holding," he said. He opened a secure channel to Black Meridian and spoke 4 words that would change the history of the galaxy. "Wake the Leviathans up." The Velthari Empire had spent 12,000 years teaching the galaxy that resistance was futile, and that obedience was the only path to survival. And for 12,000 years that lesson had held because no species had ever possessed the means to prove it wrong. That changed on a single day across 100 star systems when humanity launched Operation Prometheus Rising, and the galaxy learned what happened when you cornered a species that had been preparing for the worst since before it could write its own name. The Velthari were expecting more of the same: defensive actions, guerrilla raids, hit-and-run tactics designed to bleed their forces slowly. What they got instead was a full, unrestricted offensive on every front simultaneously, and the first thing they noticed was that they could not see it coming. Human ships equipped with the new Black Meridian FTL drives did not use the Empire's ancient relay network, which meant they left no transit signatures, no energy trails, no traceable wakes in subspace. They simply appeared, behind Velthari lines, inside the conquered colonies, at strategic Imperial outposts hundreds of light years from the nearest human territory, as if they had materialized out of nothing. In the first 12 hours of Operation Prometheus Rising, human strike forces hit 47 Imperial positions across 3 sectors, and the Velthari command structure, which had operated with smooth efficiency for millennia, descended into chaos because they could not figure out where the attacks were coming from or how to predict where the next one would land. But the strike forces were not the main event. The main event announced itself above the Imperial military staging world of Koreth Prime, a heavily fortified planet that served as the primary supply hub for the Velthari forces operating in human space. The sky above Koreth Prime split open, and something emerged from faster-than-light travel that made every sensor operator on every ship and station in the system stop breathing. It was the size of a small moon. It was covered in weapons arrays that glowed with a cold blue light. It moved with a precision and grace that should have been impossible for something that massive, like watching a mountain dance. It was the Leviathan-designated Titan, the first of 7, and it broadcast a single message on every frequency in every language in the Galactic Standard Database. "This is Aegis Collective Unit 1 Designate Titan. All personnel on Koreth Prime and in orbital installations have 1 standard planetary rotation to evacuate. After that window closes, all military infrastructure in this system will be destroyed. This is your only warning." The voice was calm and clear and completely without emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying than any battle cry could have been. The Velthari garrison commander, a veteran of 200 years of service, looked at his tactical display and saw that Titan's weapons systems alone outgunned his entire defense fleet by a factor of approximately 40 to 1. He ordered an immediate attack anyway, because that was what Velthari commanders did. They attacked, always, regardless of the odds, because the Empire had never built a weapon it could not overcome. 600 warships converged on Titan in a perfect assault formation and unleashed everything they had. Energy beams capable of cutting through planetary shields struck Titan's hull and dissipated like water hitting hot stone. Missile barrages that could crack continents exploded against its adaptive nanoarmor and left nothing but fatting scorch marks that healed themselves in seconds. Kinetic rounds traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light hit its surface and simply stopped, their energy absorbed and redistributed through systems that the Velthari could not even begin to understand. Titan did not fire back immediately. It waited until the Velthari fleet had exhausted its first volley, almost as if it wanted them to understand exactly how futile their attack was. Then it responded. The battle, if it could even be called a battle, lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the Velthari defense fleet had ceased to exist, and Titan hung in orbit above Korath Prime like a silent judgment, waiting patiently for the evacuation window to expire. The garrison commander ordered immediate evacuation. Across the galaxy, the other 6 Leviathans deployed to strategic positions, and everywhere they appeared the result was the same: overwhelming, unstoppable force delivered with a cold, mechanical patience that gave the enemy every chance to withdraw before the destruction began. Because that was the part that confused the Velthari more than anything else. Humanity had built weapons capable of ending civilizations, weapons that could crack planets and burn fleets and reshape the geography of star systems. And they gave warnings first. They offered evacuation windows. They targeted military infrastructure and spared civilian populations when possible. This was not how the galaxy worked. When you had absolute power, you used it absolutely, without mercy, without hesitation, because mercy was weakness and weakness was death. But humans apparently had not received that particular lesson, or more likely they had received it and decided it was wrong. While the Leviathans dismantled the Empire's military infrastructure with terrifying efficiency, something even more devastating was happening inside the Empire itself. The vassal species were rising. The Rithkai, 6,000 years of slavery finally reaching a breaking point, swarmed the imperial shipyards in their home system with millions of workers who turned their construction tools into weapons and seized control of the facilities in a matter of hours. The Delveni, whose strategic brilliance the Empire had exploited for millennia, while keeping them confined to their ocean worlds, used their deep knowledge of imperial communication systems to shut down the military command network across an entire sector. The Gorathi, the stone-skinned giants who had been used as shock troops by the Empire for thousands of years, simply turned around and started walking toward their masters. On 100 worlds, in 1,000 stations, species that had been obedient and broken and silent for longer than human civilization had existed looked at what 5 billion humans had accomplished by refusing to kneel, and they remembered what it felt like to stand up. The Empire was not just losing a war, it was losing the very foundation it was built on. Obedience, once broken, could not be repaired. High Warlord Sareth watched her empire crumble on her tactical displays and made the decision she had been moving toward for months. She contacted Admiral Mwangi through a secret channel and requested a meeting under a flag of truce. They met aboard a neutral station in a system that had been emptied by the war, just the two of them, the finest military minds on opposite sides of a conflict that had killed millions, sitting across a bare metal table in a cold room. Sareth studied the human admiral and saw what she had expected to see: not a monster, not a conqueror, but a tired, determined man who wanted the killing to stop. "The Emperor will never surrender," she told him bluntly. "He is 9,000 years old and he has never lost, and he would rather see the galaxy burn than accept defeat." "I know," Mwangi said. "I can remove him, Sareth continued. "I have enough loyal forces within the home fleet to stage a coup, but I need a guarantee that humanity will not do to the Velthari people what the Emperor tried to do to yours." Mwangi looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and then he said something that Sareth would remember for the rest of her very long life. "We came to end a tyranny, not a species. We know the difference. We have had practice." They shook hands, a human custom that Sareth had studied and understood to mean a binding of trust between equals. The plan was set, and the pieces were moving when Dr. Akafer's voice cut through Mwangi's communications like a blade. "Admiral, we have a problem." She explained it in short, clipped sentences, and with every word the blood drained a little further from Mwangi's face. Emperor Kaeldrith had activated something called the Throne's Last Light, an ancient weapon hidden in the core of Veilthai's Prime itself. Built by the founders of the Empire 12,000 years ago as a final safeguard against ultimate defeat. It worked by triggering a cascading stellar collapse, a chain reaction that would cause every star within a 200 light-year radius to destabilize and explode in sequence, sterilizing thousands of systems and killing hundreds of billions of sentient beings across dozens of species, including the Velthari themselves. Kaeldrith had decided that if his empire could not survive, then nothing would. "How long?" Mwangi asked. 72 hours until it reaches critical activation," Akafer said, and her voice was the steadiest thing in a universe that had just tilted sideways. "After that, no force in the galaxy can stop it." Mwangi closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, every trace of exhaustion was gone, replaced by something absolute and unyielding. The look of a man who had accepted that the next 3 days would determine whether 100 billion people lived or died. "Get me everyone," he said. "Every ship, every Leviathan, every ally we have, get me everyone and point them at Veilthai's Prime." The final battle was coming, and it would be the largest the galaxy had ever seen. The combined fleet that converged on Veilthai's Prime was the largest armada ever assembled in the recorded history of the galaxy, and it was a sight that would have been beautiful if it were not so terrifying. Human warships flew alongside Rithkai swarm carriers and Delveni stealth cruisers and Gorathi battle platforms, thousands of vessels from dozens of species that had never fought together before, but were now united by something stronger than strategy or alliance. They were united by the simple desire to still exist 72 hours from now. And at the center of the formation, moving with the slow, unstoppable momentum of glaciers, came the 7 Leviathans, those moon-sized monuments to human paranoia and human engineering. Their hulls glowing with restrained power, their weapons arrays dark but ready, their AI minds running calculations at speeds that made light seem slow. Admiral Mwangi stood on the bridge of the TDF Indomitable and watched the fleet take shape around him on the holographic display. And despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the fear and the knowledge of what was at stake, he felt something that he had not felt since the decree of annihilation had first crossed his desk 18 months ago. He felt hope, not because victory was certain, but because every ship out there represented a choice. A conscious decision by thousands of different beings from dozens of different species to fly toward almost certain death rather than let a tyrant burn the galaxy out of spite. That meant something. That meant everything. The loyalist Imperial fleet defending Veilthai's Prime was still enormous. Over 6,000 warships crewed by soldiers who had known nothing but obedience their entire lives, and who would fight to the last because the Emperor commanded it. But High Warlord Sareth had been busy. In the hours before the Allied fleet arrived, she had moved her pieces into position with the same cold precision that had made her the Empire's greatest commander. When the Allied fleet dropped out of FTL and the Loyalist defense fleet moved to engage, Sareth gave the signal. Half the Imperial home fleet, 3,000 warships crewed by soldiers who had chosen to follow their warlord instead of their emperor, turned their guns on the other half. The Battle of Veilthize Prime erupted in a storm of fire that lit up the void for light years in every direction. Ships exploded and broke apart and collided in the chaos of close-quarters combat, and the Allied fleet smashed into the Loyalist formation like a hammer striking glass. Mwangi commanded from the center of the maelstrom, his voice steady on the fleet-wide channel, directing squadrons and task forces with the calm precision of a man conducting an orchestra through the loudest symphony ever played. The Leviathans carved paths through the Loyalist fleet like giants wading through a river, their weapons firing in precise controlled bursts that destroyed military targets while avoiding the civilian stations and habitats that orbited Veilthize Prime. Even now, even in the final desperate hours of a war for survival, humanity chose to spare those who were not fighting. The battle raged for 6 hours, and the losses on both sides were staggering. Thousands of ships reduced to debris, millions of beings killed in the cold vacuum between the stars. But the Allied fleet was winning, slowly and surely pushing the Loyalist forces back toward the planet. And time was running out. Deep beneath the surface of Veilthize Prime, in the ancient throne room that had been the seat of imperial power for 12,000 years, the throne's last light pulsed with a deep red glow that was growing brighter with every passing minute. Emperor Kaeldrith stood before the activation matrix, his silver hands raised, his golden eyes reflecting the light of the weapon that would end everything. He had made his peace with destruction because, in his 9,000-year-old mind, a universe without the Velthari Empire was a universe that did not deserve to exist. While the battle raged in orbit, a Terran Marine assault shuttle punched through the atmosphere of Veilthize Prime under heavy fire, its hull glowing cherry red from the heat of re-entry, its pilot fighting the controls with everything she had to keep them alive long enough to reach the surface. Inside the shuttle, 24 Terran Marines checked their weapons and their armor and said nothing because there was nothing to say. They all knew the mission: reach the throne room, deactivate the throne's last light, stop the Emperor from killing 100 billion people. They all knew the odds almost zero. Their leader was Captain Rael Vasquez, a young man with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady hands. And if you had told him 2 years ago that the fate of the galaxy would come down to a 26-year-old Marine captain from a colony world called New Valentia, he would have laughed. He was not laughing now. The shuttle crashed down in the ruins of what had once been a ceremonial plaza outside the Imperial Palace, and the Marines hit the ground running because the clock in Rael's helmet display told him they had less than 40 minutes before the weapon reached critical activation. Between them and the throne room stood the Emperor's personal guard, the Deathless Legion, warriors who had been enhanced and augmented and rebuilt over thousands of years, until they were barely recognizable as biological beings anymore. They had not known defeat in 10,000 years. They were about to learn. The fighting through the palace corridors was brutal and close and savage, the kind of combat that no amount of technology could sanitize, just desperate beings trying to kill each other in hallways and stairwells, and through doorways, close enough to see the fear in each other's eyes. The Deathless Legion fought with 10,000 years of skill and experience, and absolute loyalty to their emperor. The Terran Marines fought with something older and simpler, the raw, furious refusal to let their families die. Rael lost 12 of his 24 Marines in the fighting, each one a name and a face, and a person he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But they reached the throne room. The doors were 15 meters tall and carved with scenes of imperial conquest, going back to the founding of the empire. Rael blew them open with a breaching charge and stepped through the smoke into the vast chamber beyond. Kaeldrith stood before the activation matrix, bathed in red light, and he turned to look at the young human who had come to stop him. The Emperor was ancient and terrible and beautiful in the way that a dying star is beautiful. All cold light and fading power, and the absolute certainty that everything around him would burn when he finally went out. "You are too late," Keldrith said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The sequence cannot be stopped, not by you, not by your weapons, not by your crude and stumbling species." "You are wrong," Rael said, and he held up a device that Sarith had given them before the battle, a command override built from the warlord's own access codes, designed to interface with the ancient systems that controlled the weapon. Keldrith's golden eyes widened. Rael moved toward the activation matrix, and the Emperor stepped into his path. "Your kind is a disease," Keldrith hissed, and for the first time real emotion cracked through his ancient composure, not just anger but something deeper, something like terror at the realization that the universe was changing and he could not stop it. "You are chaos and violence and noise. You do not deserve the stars." Rael looked at the Emperor, this 9,000-year-old being who had decided that billions should die because he could not accept a universe he did not control, and he felt something unexpected. He felt pity. "Maybe we are all of those things," Rael said quietly, "but we do not get to decide who deserves to exist. That is the whole point. That is what makes us different from you." He stepped forward and Keldrith attacked. The Emperor's body was enhanced by millennia of the finest biological technology the galaxy had ever produced. He was faster and stronger, and more durable than any human had a right to fight. But Rael Vasquez was a Terran Marine, and Terran Marines trained for exactly this kind of impossible situation, because humanity had always known that sooner or later, everything comes down to one person in one room making one choice. The fight was brutal and brief, and it ended with the oldest weapon humanity had ever made. A knife. Rael drove it home, and the Emperor of the Vilthari Eternal Empire fell, and 12,000 years of tyranny ended not with a grand explosion or a cosmic event, but with a young man standing over an old one in a room full of red light, breathing hard and trying not to think about how tired he was. He pressed Sarith's override device to the activation matrix. The red light flickered, stuttered, and died. In orbit above Vaelthais Prime, the Loyalist fleet received confirmation that the Emperor was dead, and one by one, ship by ship, they powered down their weapons and surrendered. The war was over. 1 year later, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at a podium in a great hall on a neutral world and looked out at the assembled representatives of over 300 species, former vassals, former enemies, and everything in between. Behind her, the symbol of the newly formed Galactic Cooperative Accord glowed softly. Not a throne or a crown, but a simple circle of interconnected stars, each one equal, none above the others. "We did not fight to rule," she said, and her voice carried the weight of everything humanity had lost and everything it had chosen not to become. "We fought because someone told us we had no right to exist. Let this be the last time anyone in this galaxy says that to anyone." The hall erupted in applause, and it sounded like thunder, and it sounded like rain, and it sounded like the first breath after nearly drowning. Admiral Mwangi retired to a quiet colony world where the sky was blue, and the grass was green, and the wind smelled like rain. He planted a garden. He grew tomatoes and sunflowers, and a type of alien fruit that the Delveni had given him as a gift, and he spent his mornings on his porch watching the sunrise and his evenings reading, and his nights sleeping without dreams for the first time in years. The Leviathans were moved to deep space, parked in the void between stars, their systems set to standby, their AI minds dreaming whatever it is that artificial intelligences dream about when they have nothing to destroy. They were a warning and a promise. Humanity hoped with every fiber of its being that they would never be needed again. But they would always be ready. Because that was what it meant to be human, to hope for the best and prepare for the worst and never, ever, ever stay down. On 100 different worlds, under 100 different skis, children of 100 different species looked up at the stars. And for the first time in 12,000 years, they were not afraid.